Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about something interesting, which is basically defining these two very similar concepts in ancient Egypt and that we also understand as Egyptologists and researchers today. And that concept is eternity and the idea of time in ancient Egypt, which is a very interesting field of study and not one that people really very much consider when they first start thinking of the different things you can study about a culture. Their conception of time is probably not at the top of what people research about these cultures, but the concept that the ancient Egyptians had of time ties in very deeply to their religious systems and cultural ideas. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about their concept of eternity. I'm joined here today by my very special guest, my cat. Would you like to say something? No. Anyway, the concept of time, as known by the ancient Egyptians, has been studied and delved into by a variety of Egyptologists, including Jan Assman and Jacobus van Dijk, which is very helpful because that allows us a synthesized look at what these concepts really mean. And the concepts I'm talking about right now are in Egyptologies called Neheh and Djet. This, of course, would have been pronounced differently in the actual ancient Egyptian language, but we always use Egyptological conventions when we are discussing these kinds of topics. In our modern culture, we view time in a sequence of past, present, and future. However, this isn't quite true for the ancient Egyptians. Like the Mayans, actually, they perceived time as being cyclical, but in two very distinct and different ways. And these were in Neheh and Djet. People often think of these terms as being synonyms, but this isn't quite true. They have different connotations that go along with the religious systems of the ancient Egyptians. Jan Assman describes the Egyptians described their own system of time as a temporal system based in perfective and imperfective. Assman describes the perfective as, quote, a process from without, understood as complete and terminated, and imperfective as, quote, a process from within, as ongoing and continuous. To understand this to a fuller extent, let's look at the creation myth of the ancient Egyptians. And we're going to kind of do a bit of generalization because, as I've stated before, there were many creation myths and ideas about creation and about higher gods in ancient Egypt. And the idea of synthesizing this into a singular religion with a singular idea of creation and of God is flawed logic when it comes to the ancient Egyptian religious system. But generally speaking, the way that the ancient Egyptians perceived of the world being created was that in the beginning there was Nun, an endless and vast ocean of primordial water. And from this primordial ocean arose some sort of demiurge/creator, like Tatenin or Ptah or Ra or Atum or Neith, although there are more. This is called the first occasion, when the first objects of creation came into being. But the thing is that this idea of creation is also renewed every single day with the rising of the sun. And so you have the first creation at the very beginning of time, which in Egyptologies is pronounced Zeptepi, or first occasion, and then you have the continuous cycle of creation and regeneration that happens with every sunrise, as Ra repeats his rising in the east like he rose from the primordial mound and the primordial waters. And so you have these two conceptions of beginning and of time. It goes along well with the concept duality that is popular in Egyptian thought, such as sky and earth, Ma'at and Isfet, feminine and masculine, fertile and infertile. He explains, quote, order, or Ma'at, lasts unchangeable forever in eternal sameness. At the same time, life is the eternal recurrence of the sun, which rises and sets daily. And of all human beings who are born and die only to be reborn in the next generation, all life is subject to this eternal cycle of death and rebirth, which is governed by life's twin, Ma'at. Van Dijk seems to insinuate here that the ancient Egyptians believed in some sort of reincarnation. However, we have to remember that the ancient Egyptian concept of regeneration and reincarnation was very different from the Eastern concept of reincarnation that we think of today when we hear the word. In ancient Egyptian thought, rebirth happens on another plane of existence. You don't really come back as another human being. You are forever yourself, in a sense, but you ascend to another plane and sort of take on new spiritual qualities. So now that we've defined eternal recurrence and eternal sameness, and we have these terms Neheh and Djet, which one applies to which? Neheh is the one that applies to eternal recurrence, meaning things that happen again and again, like the rising and setting of the sun each day. Whereas Djet refers to eternal sameness, which is basically the steady beat of life throughout the eternity of creation. In his paper, Jan Assman connects Djet to Osiris, whose rule is accomplished and complete, and Neheh to Ra, who endlessly repeats his regeneration in the sky. Correspondingly, Neheh is associated with the sky and the stars circumvention of the sky, whereas Djet seems to be used in reference to the earth and the endless duration of stone. Jacobus van Dijk offers his own explanation in his paper, as well as a bit of an explanation on how this applied to funerary rituals. He says, quote, "This new Osirian existence that the deceased achieves after death can be viewed not only as a static mode of being in eternal sameness, but also as an eternal cycle of death and resurrection in eternal recurrence. This cycle is exemplified by the sun's journey across the sky, and countless funerary texts identify the deceased with the sun god. The sun god's daily course is described as a life cycle. It is viewed as a perpetual repetition of creation." This all ties into something that I find very fascinating about ancient Egyptian religion, and that is the difference between the solar religion and the chthonic religion. This is technically the same religion, so to speak, but there seem to be two very different sects of it, which is the solar or celestial cult of Ra, and then the chthonic cult of Osiris. And these cults come together, especially in the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom, when various parts of funerary literature that were created by the ancient Egyptians come together to show that Osiris and Ra unite in the Duat before emerging again as the new sun in the next day. This unification of solar and Osirian cults is actually also seen in the pyramid texts, but it becomes very, very clearly stated in the later books of the dead. This can be a complex topic to talk about, but I find it really interesting to talk about even on a basic level, because it really goes to show how different our conceptions are from those of ancient people, and in ways that we really don't think about. By looking at the way that language is employed and used by a people, we can also see how they might have thought of their world, and this is an example of that, of Neheh versus Djet. A very common way that this is shown when you are teaching someone linguistics is by looking at how people refer to their families. In English, we have mother and father, which means that we define our parents by their genders, and we also have brother and sister, which means we also define our siblings by their genders. However, there are languages where you define if your brother is older than you or younger than you. In these systems, that age is really important. However, in English, age is just not as important. But in an Asian culture, age is really important. It shows how wise you are and how deserving you are of respect, and thus it needs to be added as a qualifier. For this, we get to see the ancient Egyptian conception of the world and of time, because we see the eternal sameness in the continued existence of our world, of us standing upon the earth. And then we also see the eternal recurrence, which is the rebirth of creation every single day. It's very fascinating to think about what the implications of this are, but I will leave that up to your imagination and your discretion and your research. I will post down in the description below all of the sources and details I used to talk about these two terms. All of the papers are really well written, and I think that they give very good information. So thank you for watching this little dive into the ancient Egyptian conceptions of time, Neheh, Djet, eternity, and creation. It's very interesting how all these topics really kind of just connect together. So let me know if you want to see more of these types of videos, and I will start researching. And I hope you have fun researching as well. Thank you for watching.